Parak of Peah. The share is brought to you through the Siyata D'Shmaya, through myself, Gerard Savary Mortgages. We are up to the second parak, which is roughly Tezayin of a base. In the parak. So, Mishka is going to tell you various things that separate a field. You might have a field, but various things within the field divide the field into two halves. And therefore there's a separate pair obligation in each half because of these divisions. So let's see, what sort of divisions are there? So in the pair, the following divide the field into two halves. For a pair, Hanachal, which is either a sort of stream, some say it's a piece of dry ground full of stones, which is not fitting for planting. The Hashalulis, which is like a sort of a ditch of water. The Derech HaYachid, which is a private way. The Derech HaRabim, and a public way, right? Now, a public way obviously is a bit wider. Derech is where people walk with their horses and wagons. Derech HaRabim, a public street, by the way, is much wider. A private one is 4 amas, and Derech HaRabim is 16 amas, okay? Let's see, Ushvil Yachid, a path for a private person, Ushvil Harabim, and a public path, which is used during the summer and during the winter. Habor, a field which has not been ploughed and not been sowed. Vahanir, that's a field that's been ploughed but not yet sowed. The Zera Acher, or if there's another type of seed which is dividing between the two parts of the field. So, for example, you had beans or other seeds in the middle of the field of wheat, that splits the field into two halves.
Wasn't it in Bavli that said that Yerushalmi is governed by the width of 3 Koroshim from...
you find in Bavli about the...
They say there's 3
16 amas.
And there was a space in between.
There was in Shabbos, you have about the wagons and where Yerushalmi comes from.
Of the woods.
Yeah. One who cuts his crop in the middle of the field he wants to use it before it's ripened, and he does it for animal food. Masik, that also divides his field into two halves. Therefore, you need peah from each area. Divrei Rameh. The Chachamim said, no, it doesn't divide. Apart from the reaping, he has to plough that area as well. Now, a shvil is different from a derech, right? A shvil is just a path where you don't have your horse and wagon. Okay? And some say the difference between shvil and derech is just the width. The shvil is more narrow, and shvil is like 4 amas, and a shvil for the rabbim is maybe a small one is like 16 amas. Okay? So these things therefore divide the field. Now the question is, what does it mean they divide the field? Does it mean they divide across the whole width of the field? Does it need to go all the way across? Does it need or not? The Rosh says it doesn't need to divide the whole field. Just because you've got a stream going across the field doesn't need to go all the way across. Although you've got some breaches in it, whatever, if it's less than 4 amas, it's considered the field is cut in half because you can cross over with your ox and your plough. Others say from the Raavad that we need a proper hefsek from edge to edge, right? You do need this stream to break the field. You need to go from one end to the other. So there's a discussion on that. So the following do separate a field as far as peah is concerned, and when you have them, you need separate peah in each area. As it says, Sadcha, the pasuk says, which is a private lashon yachid, you should not leave peah from one field for another. Okay? In fact, the Torah says Sadcha, lashon yachid. Okay, so you shouldn't leave peah from one field for another. Now, this word mechuva, a lot's been written about this word mechuva. Now, it could mean this is not clear to the Chachamim that the din of these gaps, these hefsek things, are from the Torah. They are only rabbinical. That's one way of looking at it. The word mechuva means clear, as in it's not clear that it's from the Torah, it's rabbinical, right? Another pshat is mechuvar. Some wanted to learn is mechubar with a base, right? And it's totally different discussion, really. Some learn mechuvar about the Torah din, or rabbinical din, and some say mechuvar with a vav. Okay, some says mechubar. Okay, Now, even though it's with a base, but in other words, although it's written with a base, it means vav vav reish. You understand? So even if some say that the word mechubar here doesn't mean connected to the ground, nothing to do with that. It means it's not clear to the chachamim that it was from the Torah, it was rabbinical. If you're going to tell me that this din, that let's say you've got seeds making a gap within a field, it was clear to them, that means it's from the Torah, then afilus de ha'ilan mafsik, then even in a tree field, these things should create a division, and yet they don't. The Tanina Tamad, we've learned Hakol Mafsik Zeraim, everything makes a gap, right, in our Mishnah, and it's only for a seed field these things make a gap, like the ditch or whatever it is. But not for a tree field. Elageda, you need a fence 10 tefachim high. So you see that these laws of Hefsek in our Mishnah are only rabbinical, because they don't work in a field of trees. They have to have a chiyuv peah. You have peah with trees as well, with olives and grapes, whatever it is. So that's why it must be that they are only rabbinical. Then he says, so the ones who learn the word mechuba with a base, they learn it to do with connected to the ground or not. They learn the whole sugya differently. Anyway, hagada mechuba. If you do separate your field through a fence, and you're going to tell me it's clear from the Torah that the fence is mafsik between a field of seeds and a field of trees, if it always works, ve'ena mechuba. But even separation from a fence is not actually clear from the Torah. Because in Tema Mechuba, if you're going to tell me it's clear from the Torah, then afilu se'ah kaisesh. Now, se'ah kaisesh is when you have branches. Imagine you have two trees on different fields, and you have a fence in between, and the branches from either side sort of mesh and interleave with each other. You understand? So you've got the branches from each side going above the fence, which is separating between the two fields. Now, if you're going to tell me mechuba that it's clear, then even if the branches on two sides join up above the fence and touching each other, that fence should be masik, should make a separation between them. But it doesn't. The Tanina, because we learned that Mishnah, if the branches are interweaving, is that a better word? Above that, then that cancels the effect of the fence, and the fence has no effect, it's considered one big field. You leave one area peah for the whole area. Hadar Amra, this must tell me that the din of the fence making a gap between the two, Eina Mechuba, is not from the Torah, it's only rabbinical. And that's why when the branches are interweaving, then the fence does not separate the two entities. Now then the one wants to say, well, it could be in Tema Mechubahu. Maybe we'll say what we said before, that the separating of the fence is from the Torah. Now you told me, well, if it's from the Torah, why does it not stop the branches interweaving and joining up? You're going to tell me, well, maybe that's also from the Torah, that the branches joining up can cancel the effect of the fence. You can't say that, because if that's the case, afilu mitzad echad, even if the branches are only coming from one side, and so they're crossing over the fence to the other side and interweaving there, but the other side are not going back, so all the branches coming from one side to the other, then even mitzad echad la yafsik, that the fence shouldn't have any effect. And the din is not so. The Tani we've learned, if, however, the field mekan, it says if the branch is going from both sides, ena mafsik, then that doesn't stop. The fence doesn't break them up. If the branches are coming from one side only, then mafsik, then the fence does create a gap between the two. Now, if the din was from the Torah about these branches, then it makes no difference between whether they're coming from one side or two sides. Right? It must be basically that the din of the branches connecting is only a rabbinical din, and the raya comes back that any din of separating two fields with a fence, it's only a rabbinical separation, really. Right? It's only a rabbinical separation that a fence breaks up the fields. Rabbi Yosef Shem Hanina, he said, the din of the Torah, if you went and hifrish peah beside lechaveta, if you separated peah from one field for another, like katra, peah is not chal. The second field remains with its obligation. It is not effective what you've done. Rav Zira by Kum Rabbi Yasa, Zira asked, now what about, imagine two fields, and you have a border between them. You had the intention, you want to putter the field from the border, so the second field you want to leave Peah in one field on this side of the border. Are we going to cover the second field? Now, what does that mean? So you've got two fields. You've got, let's say, a meitzah is like a border. It's like a strip of land, right, which is separating between the fields. Maybe a bit higher, a bit lower than the fields on its side. And what are you trying to do? You intend to patter the field, let's say from the border, the second field, by a peah which you're leaving in this field on this side of the border. So, I mean, does the second field get covered or not? It says here, we're not. The Mishnah never said a border is a sort of a mafsik, a gap as far as peah is concerned. But as far as acquisition of fields, which you can acquire with a chazaka, right? We find that a meitzah, a border, is a gap when it comes to acquisition. Okay, you find that by Basra. So here, what are you trying to do? You got two fields separate. You got a border. It seems you're intending this as far as you want to acquire, right? You want to acquire the field from the border and onwards through peah that you're leaving on this side. You know, I mean, and you want to sort of patter the second field as well. Does that help or not? No. This guy's. I think you want to patter the field, right? You want to patter the field of peah. Right, so I'm just trying to see how I learnt here. You've got this border. They've got the border in between. And Liz goes when I say you want to patter the field on the other side of the border through peah you're leaving in this side of the border. And do you cover yourself or not? Yerushalmi now. Now Rabbi Yossi didn't like that question, so he just shrugged it off. He didn't bother answering it. Okay, he didn't want to answer it. He wasn't sure at the end of the day. What is the border? Is it masik between two fields as far as peah or not? It's like a strip of land, right? Does that divide up two fields, right? Now we find Rabbi Yasser elsewhere where it seems to imply that a border is definitely separating as far as peah is concerned. So we have a contradiction with what he said elsewhere. The Tanina Tamam, we've learnt later on in third parak. They agree if you sow mustard seeds or whatever it is, sheves is what they call dill, right? Or mustard seeds in 3 places. You leave peah for each area in its own right. So what does that mean? So he says, this is shot in the Mishnah. Sheves b'shloshim mekomas, so chada b'shloshim mekomas. You left dill in 3 places, mustard in 3 places. So now, what's that talking about? The Chachamim agree with these things. What does that mean? So Shmuel said, the Chachamim agree with these things. You have to leave peah for each separate area. Why is that? The first plant doesn't wait to ripen. It doesn't wait for the last one, right? So they ripen at different times. And since they don't ripen together, they're not cut together. Therefore, you have to leave peah for each one in its own right, for each separate area. Rabbi Yasser Shem Rabbi Yochanan, he said the reason why the Chachamim agree you have to leave peah for each separate area, because it's the custom to sow these things in different patches. Each patch is considered a field in its own right. Therefore, each patch needs its own peah. Now, what it comes out, that even if you're sowing many patches near each other, you have to leave peah for each side, each area. The reason is because that border separates those patches, you see? And that's why the Gemara now brings this question. And here he says differently. Why here? Rabbi Yasser didn't want to answer Rabbi Zira's question, and he wasn't sure if a border makes a gap with a field. So with these little patches, the border makes a gap. And yet here we had the question, he didn't want to answer it. So the Gemara answers, let's re-understand our question of Rabbi Zira, why Rabbi Yasser didn't want to answer it. He says, it was clear to Rabbi Zira, Shu Masik, that the border does break up the 2 fields, and the Chiv pay on each one. Now, delay always is short for D'Eloi, or something like that. D'Eloi. They always say Da Ella. Sounds right. Yeah, Da Ella. You understand? Da Ella. Not this, but. So that's delay. So Rabbi didn't have to ask that question. Da Ella, but you understand? That's what did he need to ask? Kidsha Mishum Peah or like Kidsha. What he's asking is like this: the stuff that grows on the border, can you make that peah for the fields next to it? You hear that? If it grows on the border, can you make that peah or not? And on this question, Rabbi Yassa did not want to answer. Tiny Rabbi Moshe led to the brisa. Hifrish peah masada lechaverta. You separate peah from one field for the other. Like it doesn't work. Ushma meima. We learned from this pirush. Afilu meitza. Even if you left it on the border for a field nearby, is not effective. It doesn't cover the field on its side. The din of the border is like a separate area, and it doesn't help. Rabbi Yosef Chanina Amar, he said, chatzuvos. Now these are plants which grow in the middle of the field, types of chatzuvos plants. Mafsikin lepeah. We don't really have a translation of it, but they do make a division as far as peah. You have to leave peah for each area. Rav Chisda asked, Bahen, actually boy here doesn't mean asked, sorry, boy here means just he wanted to say. Bahen chilek yeshuas haaretz. He used these plants to divide up the land because the plants grow straight down. They don't start moving to side, and they use that to divide the land for the tribes, right? And the answer of Rav Chanina came along from Bava, and he said, Rav Chisda, Bahem techam yeshuas haaretz. With them, he signed out the borders of the land between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. Okay, now we said sorts of ditches are mismasik in a field as far as peah is concerned. Now there's nachal and shululis. What's the difference? Shululis is like a ditch of water. Koshi moisheches, the water flows in it. Nachal breaks up a field. Af b'sheina moishech, even though there's no water there. There's no water flowing. It's sort of gathered in one area. And that's the reason the mission has to mention both of them. Mekiva de Tanina, now which we've learned derech hayachid, we said a private path makes a gap with a field. Derech harabim masuch. Why do I have to tell you about a public one? If a private one makes a gap, definitely a public one would. Okay. Asa memalach. So the Gemara answers, afilu derech harabim eina masig le'ilan. Even as the public path doesn't make a gap with a tree field, only with a seeds field, right? For a field of trees to break it up, you need a geder. You need a fence. Okay. Now, there are also types of paths which are dividing in a field as far as peah. When you use them, we said all year, a private path, a public path. We said a private path is the break up as far as peah is concerned. Why mention a public one? So he says, we want to exclude those public paths, which may be used in the summer, not used in the winter, right? They have to be fixed all year round to be a valid break between the fields. If they're not passable during the rainy season, then they're not an absolute division within the field. We sort of various other things. You leave an area fallow, or you've ploughed it. We spoke about various other divisions as far as peah is concerned. Rava abor is ground which has not been ploughed and not been sowed. The near is ground which has been ploughed and not sown yet. Now they don't make a hefsek in a field unless there's a shield base roiva. You need an area which is enough to grow a quarter cov of seeds. And that area is 104.16 square amas. Okay? 104.16 square amas. Because an area of a base of Chaim is where you grow 2 sah, which is 100 by 50, right? 5,000 amas. And each sah has got 6 kav, which is 24 quarter kav. So base of Chaim can hold 48 quarter kav. And the area is 1 over 48 times 5,000, which is 104.16 square amas. Okay, so the area for these things to divide is got to be a shear which you can sow a quarter kav, and basically it's 104 square amas. So the longer it is, the narrower it is. You understand? If you have a long path of 104 amas, then it just has to be 1 amma wide. And we discussed earlier the discussion, does it have to go exactly all the way across the field or not? The discussion on that. But for it to be noticeable as this gap, it's got to be 104 square amas in total. Okay? Zera acher, any other seeds in the middle of the field, they make a division. Afilu koshu, even the smallest width, right? The smallest width is enough to separate between the two parts of the field. Whereas when you've got fallowed land or whatever, that's empty land, you don't notice it so much. So you need that 104, okay? Now, Rabbi Yochanan, he said, Ba v'nir v'zera acher, all three of them, shloisha telamim shel pasiach. He said you need a width of 3 mounds of the of the plow, which opens up the ground. Now, basically, that's an area of 2 amas, right? Now, it's not an area, sorry, it's a size, it's a length of 2 amas. If it's done after the rain, it's sort of the furrow of the 3 plows. We're going to see it might be times 50, which ends up being 100, which is slightly similar to the 104 we had already. But at the moment, we just said it's this sort of width of 2 amas wide. So he says, Ma'o Palig. So you're going to tell me he's arguing. We said 100 and now you're saying 2. He says, Madam Rav, that which Rav says other seeds are mastic, even the smallest amount, but that is where there's a type, a chiyuv peah, where that seed also has its own peah obligation. Right? Madam Rav Yochanan, that which Rav Yochanan said that the seed has to be, let's say, 2 amas to divide, that is b'ptur peah, with a seed which doesn't have its own peah obligation, like vegetables. He says, now wait a minute, so areas which are fallow or empty, they've been ploughed, they have a pay obligation? Surely not. How can you answer that, that's talking about a fallow piece of land? So the one answers, Mado Amarav, the fact that which Rav said that the share of Bor Vanir is base rover, and other seeds he said the smallest amount, he says it depends what size field we're dealing with. He says, Besada Beinanis, that's talking about a normal field which is bigger than a base rover. It's bigger, right? And it's bigger than the 104 square amas, whatever it is. And that which Rav Yochanan said that the 3 amastic have to be, let's say, 2 amas, but chamishim al shtayim. That is a small field, which is 50 by 2, and that is a bus rover. It's slightly less than a bus rover. So basically, we're saying it depends on the size of the field. So let's say like this. So with a normal field, you need an area of bor veneer area, fallowed land, right? The shear that can grow a base rover, which is 104 square amas, right? But you mustn't have less than a width of 2 amas across. So, for example, if the length of the field is 104, then it's not good enough that the area that you have, the division is, let's say, 1 amma, okay? Even if it's a base rover, it's not good enough. Because less than 2 amas, you don't notice it. You understand? If you have less than 2 amas division, you don't notice it at all. Okay? That's but with a small field. If the whole field is only 104 amas, you don't need 104 amas gap in it, right? So if it's a massive field, you need 104 amas. If the whole field is only 104 amas, then in that case, you don't need a gap of 104. You just need a little width of 2 amas going along. That's what you need. Is that clear, Rabbi Say? So it really depends on the size of the field as to how much you need to be the gap to be noticeable that there is a division here. Okay. It also depends on how big the field is and what you've sown in, or have you sown something in, or you just left it gap. That's what everything depends on. One who plants something and then you collect it, you cut it premature when it's not yet ripe, and you cut it, let's say, for the animals. Now, Rameir holds, even if you cut everything in the middle of the field and it's premature, it's not ripened yet, that divides the field into 2 parts, okay? And you have to separate peah from each part separately. The Chachamim hold, cutting it for shachas when it's still not ripe doesn't divide the field, and 1 lot of peah is enough, unless you ploughed there as well. So now Rav Zira now is going to explain the view of Rav Meir. He says cutting for the animals when it's not ripe does break up the field, because that shachas has got its own pay obligation, and it's called cutting. And he brings another Tana who agrees with this thing. So Rav Zira, Rav Elazar, Rav Meir, Rav Yehuda, Shnei Mamre Davar Echad, they both said one thing, that when you cut the crops for the animals when it's not ripened yet, Kamader Me'ama, now just like Rav Meir said in our Mishnah, that Akaisa L'Shachas Masik, when you cut and it's not ripe yet, it divides the field as far as peah is concerned between the 2 halves. It's called cutting, it's called harvesting. Kain Rabbi Yehuda, so Rabbi Yehuda said, Hakaisa l'shachas, if you cut for the animals, this unripened stuff, in the middle of the field, masik, it divides, it's got a name of katsira. Now Rabbi Yehuda was talking about, what was Rabbi Yehuda talking about? He was talking about before the Omer offering has been brought. And you're cutting stuff when normally you can't harvest anything before the Omer offering. But this has got a name of cutting. So it's included in the prohibition of cutting the new grain before the Omer. So similarly, so we're saying just like Rameir said it's called cutting and harvesting, and it's got its own Chiyuv Peah. So Rabbi Yehuda said it's called cutting, that it's forbidden to do it before the Omer offering. And Kamad Rabbi Yehuda Amar, just like Rabbi Yehuda said Chiyuv Peah Mafsik, that the reason why the cutting, when it's unripe, it's got a name of cutting because it's Chayav Peah, and therefore it divides the field as far as Peah is concerned, and you can't cut it before the Omer. Kain Rameh Omer, and Rameh will also say Chiyuv Peah Mafsik, that the reason why it's Mafsik in the field because it has its own Chiyuv Peah obligation. That which you're cutting for these animals has its own obligation according to Rameh, right? The Chachamim argue, but that's Rameh's view. Now he says,
and that which you said earlier, that if you have dough and other stuff, it's all separate. Each plant it's got its own little patch. It's a smaller patch. What if you cut it all together? Because
there are borders there. Each one we said was surrounded by a border of some kind, so they're not really connected.
So even if you cut
There's a difference between little patches.
Yeah,
because they're considered like little patches rather than one big field.
The argument there was that we don't cut them all at the same time because they ripen at different
They do ripen at different times as well.
So what if you cut them anyway for the animals?
Well, if you're cutting them all early, well, as Rameh will say, that's considered a cutting. But a pay on each one, you mean? Because they have their own borders as well. Good, if you're ripening, cutting them all, maybe Rameh will say, well, there's a Chiyuv Peah there. But the Chachamim argue. So let's see now. This idea of shachas, before the other stuff is ripe for the animals. Rav Shimon in our Mishnah actually allows you to cut shachas, the Mishnah in Menachos, even after it's grown a third. Rabbi Yehuda allows it if it's not yet grown a third, and Rabbi Zeira understood that it's permitted before the Omer, because it's not called cutting, and Rabbi Yehuda, who asks it after it's grown a third, he holds that this cutting has got a name of cutting. And he agrees to Rameh that if you're cutting for shachas, it's mafsik as far as Peah is concerned, but it's called cutting. Right? The Chachamim argue, they say it's not considered, it doesn't divide the field. They hold like Rav Shimon in Menachos, who allows you to cut it before the Omer offering, even after it's grown a third. They said it's not considered cutting, right? Therefore it doesn't divide the field, there's no issue to cut it before the Omer. You understand? So the Chachamim have a different view completely. So where are we up to? And where do we find the Rameh Omer Chiyuv Peah Mafsik, that anything which has its own Chiyuv obligation, which he says Shachas has, that divides the field? Like we've learned, if locusts eat a crop in the middle of the field, other insects go and attack it. The wind breaks it down, the animal broke it down. Patura, that's parted from Peah, because that cutting was not with a person involved. That's not considered cutting. So in this situation, everyone agrees that after that cutting charash, if you went and ploughed that area, masik, then it divides up the field and divides it into two, and you have to leave two pairs because you did the ploughing. But the cutting which animals do is not considered cutting. If you didn't plough the area, masik, it doesn't divide the field as far as Peah is concerned. Now, Mani, who is this in the Brisa where he says Hakol Moedim? Everyone agrees. Surely it's Rameh, who holds that if you cut stuff which is not yet ripened, it's mafsik in the field. And the Brisa tells you, if it was cut not through a person, even Rameh agrees it's not mafsik in the field unless you ploughed there. But Amar, and he said, he says this cutting is parted from leaving Peah. If it had an obligation in Peah, like people cut it after it grew a third, even if you didn't plough the area, masik, it will start dividing the field. So it really depends on the Chiyuv Peah in that area. Yeah, according to Rameh, it's got its own Chiyuv Peah, and therefore it's considered breaking up the two fields on either side. Okay, now we said the view of Rabbi Yehuda, that cutting shachas is also before the Omer offering because the Chiyuv Peah makes it considered a ksira. He said it's considered a cutting, a harvesting. Where do we find Rabbi Yehuda said this? We've learned in a Mishnah in Menachos. Rabbi Yehuda said, "Hey Mosai, when are you allowed to cut the shachas before the Omer offering? Rabbi Yehuda holds you got to start cutting it before a third. It's not called cutting if you start so prematurely that it's not even grown a third. If it grew a third, also liksar, you're not allowed to cut it before the Omer offering. Once it's grown a third, it's called harvesting. And yiksar, if you're going to cut it even one bit, you're chayav b'peah, you have to separate peah there. V'daba shu chiyuv peah mafsik, and if it's got its own chiyuv obligation in peah, it divides up in the field. So from this price, you see that the reason of Yehuda is because anything with its own peah obligation is dividing up the field, and we find a chiyuv obligation with shachas, with its food, which you are harvesting for the animals. Now, the Mishnah Menachos talks about cutting before the Omer, and Rabbi Yehuda says this in, as long as you started before it grew a third, right? So it sounds like if you start cutting before it grows a third, you can carry on cutting even later, even after it grows a third, as long as you start early enough. Now, based on that, Rabbi Yehuda there about cutting before the Omer, and we also said it depends on his chiyuv peah as well, is there a chiyuv peah or not? Now, as far as peah is concerned, the din should be the same then. That if you start cutting before the third, then there's no chiyuv peah even if you carry on with the harvesting after it grows a third later on. You hear that? Should I say that line again? We're saying if we are equating the peah din to the permitting for you to cut before it's reached the third, then if there's no problem, once you start harvesting early and it's not grown a third, we say, well, if you started early, you can carry on harvesting even afterwards. If that's the case, then the same din would apply, that there will be no peah obligation. So here Reb Zeira adds on that Reb Meir agrees to this kula as far as the fields being divided. If you start cutting the shachas before it grew a third, then it's not going to divide up the field, even if you carried on cutting after it grew a third later on. Now, how do we understand this? So what, you start cutting before it grows a third, but then we say you carry on cutting. So what are you cutting? I suppose the rest of the patch, I suppose.
Or as it grows.
As it grows, maybe. And it would have grown a third had you left it. So you cut it less than a third, and then it carries on growing. Yeah. And I suppose had you left it, it would have been a third. We're not. Or are we talking about different areas? You start cutting the area. You cut this one less than a third. Well, it's not less than a third in the next bit. But yeah, but you started this patch. I'm not sure. Is he talking about that each bit as it grows? Well, it's always going to be less than a third. It grows less than a third. Well, it sounds like it carries on growing more than a third, and you've finished your cutting. Maybe the different areas is considered one area in this respect. So Reb Zira wanted to say, Kamad Reb Yehuda Amar, I don't know if they've got any notes about that point, I'm not sure. Kamad Reb Yehuda Amar, just like Reb Yehuda said, that in Hischil, if you start cutting it before it reaches a third, shlish, afilu, and even if you carried on cutting after Hivir Shlish, after it grew a third, potter min aleket min hasheicha min hapeah, you're still potter from all these exemptions, from all these gifts. Kain Reb Meir says, Hischil, if you start cutting ad Hivir Shlish before it grew a third, afilu, you carried on cutting Hivir Shlish after it grew a third, potter min aleket min hasheicha min hapeah. You are potter from all these things, and the same thing as far as dividing in the field. If you start cutting this animal food before it grew a third, even though you finished cutting after it grew a third, they do not make any divisions in the field as far as peah is concerned. So here as well, the word boy just means he said, Razira. Yeah, he's not asking anything. Okay, let's carry on. Amos, yeah, did you see any notes about that point or not? No. Let's see if I've got anything here. No. Sounds like you're carrying on cutting after it's a third. Maybe there's different areas. Yeah. There's this bit I cut before, but then that bit was still growing. But I'm in the process of cutting it. Sounds like. Otherwise, how's it ever going to get to a third if you cut it before a third? That's it, yeah. Yes, unless it carries on growing, as you said, it would have reached a third. Maybe something like that. Okay, Amos Hamayim. You've got a stream of water which goes in the middle of a field, and the width of it is she'eni yachalei katzeh ka'achas. You can't cut both sides in one go. So you can't cut both sides because this stream is breaking up your field. Rabbi Yehuda said Masechet. Well, if that's the case, it divides your field into two, and you have two peah obligations. There's like a mountain that because of its slant, you can't plow properly. You can have to just hoe a bit with your hands and so on. You can't plow properly. Even though the cattle can't start going on this mountain Bekelav with the yoke and everything, the field next to the mountain is not considered as a separate field. You can still give one area of peah for all this. The mountain, you can plow it. Now, you can't use the plow, but you can use your hands through other types of ploughing things. And it's considered the same as the field, with the fields around it. There are other Pirushim as well. Amasamayim. So we would have said, if you've got, let's say, a stream dividing, and you can't cut everything both sides together. Now, is he arguing on our Mishnah? The previous Mishnah said that there's no shear, like a little stream is mafsik, and he seems to say, well, it depends, can you reach both sides? So the Bnei Shiva wanted to say, but lo pligim. We're not arguing on Rabbi Yehuda. Ashkach has Tani, but we find a brisa which says, Amas hamayim kavua, if it's a fixed stream which is used all year, harez Masechet, it divides. And the brisa actually carries on. Rabbi Yehuda said, if you can't cut both together, it divides. So the beginning of the brisa is the Chachamim who argue on Rabbi Yehuda. They hold the stream is always dividing if it's there regularly for use. Even if you can cut both sides together, they hold a stream divides. Now, what about if you can't cut both sides together? What does Rabbi Yehuda say? So they wanted to say, that which Rabbi Yehuda said, you can't cut both sides in one go. It sounds like it needs to be wide, that you can't cut the crops, at the same time, both sides. You just can't cut it. Mm-hmm. And in this situation, it's talking about where you're standing on one side, and you can't start cutting the other side. You understand? You're on one side of the stream, you can't cut the side on the other side. So it divides up. Now, what happens if you're in the middle of the stream? If you are standing in the middle of the stream, and you can cut both sides at the same time. He says, then it's not a division. You'll get wet, but then it's not a division. Ain't a masik, then it doesn't break the field. So it doesn't separate the field. So if you could stand in the middle and cut both sides, it doesn't separate. Ashkach Tani or Pudding, but they found a Tana and a Bryce who argues on Bnei Shiva. The Bryce says no. Even if you're standing in the middle, yeah, you can cut both sides. I'm afraid, mafsik, it still divides up the field. This field, this width is enough. If you can't reach it from one side to the other, that's enough to be a division. I don't care if you could stand in the middle and reach both sides. I don't care about that. But if you're standing with tzad, and if you can stand on one side and you can reach the stuff on the other side, then even according to Yehuda, ein a mafsik, it doesn't divide up in the field. Okay, B'chol harim, and all the mountains. Okay, let's see if we get to the end of the halacha. Reb Chia barada b'shem Moshe ben Lakish hayesham sela pnei kol sadeh. Now, if you have a rock, the width of your field, there's like rocky areas there. Okay, and now if it's higher from the ground and you want to take your plow from side to side, you've got to pick up your plow because the rock's in the way and put it on the other side, then that rock is going to divide up in the field. But if it's like sunken the rock, you don't have to uproot the plow when you go from side to side. You can drag it across. It doesn't divide in the field. But we've learned in a brisa that if you had your field, now imagine you have various furrows and they're on a slant of a mountain. Imagine furrows on a mountain and you've got like steps on the mountain and they're like 10 tefachim apart, different ridges along the mountain, where you definitely can't start ploughing from one ridge to another ridge which is 10 tefachim higher. You definitely can't do that. So nice and peah b'kol echad b'echad. You leave peah, each ridge has its own peah, right? Because each one is inaccessible to the others. Now, pachas mikan, if it's less than 10 tefachim high, the next ridge, nice and me'echad ala kol, you can leave one lot of peah for the whole thing. So the Gemara is going to ask, Reb Chia barada, he says, as far as we said before, if you can pick up the plough, not pick up the plough. But here we're saying if it's within 10 tefachim of the ridge, you can keep one lot of peah for the lot. A pachas mikan. Now, when these steps, these ridges, which are less than 10 tefachim, how are you going to get your plough to 8 tefachim higher on the hill? How are you going to do it? Even less than 10 tefachim, you can't just plough just like that. You've got to pick up the whole thing, go up to the next ridge, and carry on. Why give one lot of peah for the whole thing? Surely you have to pick up the plough. So the Gemara answers, you know something? even if it's the steps which are less than 10 tefachim, of course you have to pick up your plough from one side. And there is a separate peah obligation in each ridge. La'asinan misnei asara, the only reason why we mention 10 tefachim is that it begins sofa, because the end of the brisa which says, Shemhayu Rashi Madregas Muravin. Now imagine these ridges meet at one point. So it's like a zigzag going up the hill. And the ridges might be higher, but then they come down a bit and meet the next ridge, and it comes down and meets the next ridge. So Imhayu Rashi Madregas Muravin. If one mound is going from under the mountain till the top, and they connect all the steps, all the ridges meet at one point, then then the Brisa says in these sort of ridges, they might be 10 tefachim high, but in this situation, because they join up, you can give one lot of peah, even if there is more than a 10 tefachim gap between them, because they do meet at various points, and therefore that's enough for you to be able to plough the whole area together. So there's one peah obligation. All right.
You want to mention next week?
Not yet.